All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything on Rescheduling Cannabis, hosted by the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation, or CPEAR. My name is Shanita Penny, and I serve as the director of the CPEAR Center of Excellence. We are honored to be joined by two leading experts in their respective fields who will provide unique insights into the current rescheduling landscape. Dr. Staci Gruber is a Harvard Medical School professor and director at McLean Hospital. Considered a leading researcher in her field, Dr. Gruber studies topics including the impact of cannabis on the brain and the relationship between symptoms of psychiatric disorders and substance use. She also works to educate policymakers and the general public through research publications, including authoring CPEAR's first consumer and product safety-focused paper, What's in Your Weed, alongside Dr. Kelly Sager of Harvard Medical School. Dr. Gruber, thank you for your important work and making time for us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Next up is Amber Littlejohn, a regulatory expert with ICE Miller. As a lawyer, strategist, and business advocate, she provides expertise in highly regulated industries, including cannabis and hemp. Considered a nationally recognized voice in the cannabis industry, she has testified before Congress on issues including small business capital access and cannabis regulation. Amber, as always, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us today.
Of course, any time that I get to spend with you talking about regulations, even better.
I love to hear it. It's funny, we've talked about this a number of times. I am glad that people will be able to benefit from our banter back and forth on the topic.
Absolutely.
We're gonna jump right in, guys. I'm gonna give a little bit of an overview, but I'm also gonna look to you to help table set as well. In October 2022, the Biden administration issued a directive ordering the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice to review the current scheduling of cannabis under the Controlled Substances Act. In late 2023, or August 2023, HHS recommended that the Drug Enforcement Administration move cannabis from a Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 classification under the CSA. However, final authority on the matter rests with the DEA. As recently as March 2024, Vice President Kamala Harris called for the DEA to reschedule cannabis as quickly as possible at a White House event for people who received cannabis pardons. Questions are swirling about the difference between rescheduling and descheduling, the timeline, and what a decision to reschedule cannabis might mean for federal cannabis regulation. So let's hear from our experts and get some of your questions about rescheduling cannabis answered today. Dr. Gruber, how would you describe the current rescheduling landscape and what effect, if any, it has on your work?
So, I think it's important to keep things in perspective. And I always remind people it's important to figure out how we got to where we are so we can figure out where we're going. And something that's often overlooked is that marijuana or cannabis, depending on the term you're going to use, and that also becomes a little bit of an issue when we get into the actual scheduling, because we tend to use the term cannabis or marijuana to describe anything and everything from the plant Cannabis sativa L. And that becomes an important distinction later on. But I want to remind everybody that cannabis was legal in this country. In 1850, it was part of our pharmacopoeia, which meant that doctors could and did prescribe cannabis. It wasn't a recommendation or certification for use. It was a prescription. Schedule 1 substances can't be prescribed. Just a fun fact, spoiler alert. So in 1850, it was legal. It was part of our pharmacopoeia. And let's just say through a series of socio-political events, it fell out of favor. It became illegal in 1937, and it was pulled from our pharmacopoeia in 1942. And in 1970, it was placed in the then newly created Controlled Substance Act, which you referred to in your overview. The most restrictive class of the Controlled Substance Act is Schedule 1, where it remains today. But people often don't understand what the Controlled Substance Act is. What is a controlled substance, right? So the CSA is basically a classification schedule that helps us categorize current and developing drugs, which in turn helps lawmakers or enforcers or healthcare providers or experts understand how to most appropriately handle and regulate particular substances. And it's important to understand that, because to understand the shift from Schedule 1, where it wound up not necessarily because of a series of well-planned evaluations and explorations, but where we are today in terms of Schedule 1 and why we're thinking of Schedule 3, it's important to think about where we've been. A potential rescheduling from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 is also important to identify and acknowledge what a difference a letter makes, right? Rescheduling is not descheduling. So
Tell
I
them
get this.
again.
Say it again?
Tell them again.
Yes.
Rescheduling is not
What a
descheduling.
difference a letter makes, right? Rescheduling is not descheduling. Rescheduling. So scheduled substances are those that are regulated by the government. Descheduled substances are those that have no oversight by the government. And I won't step into the legal landscape. That's Amber's job. But I hear from folks all the time, well, if it gets rescheduled, I can get cannabis anywhere and I won't have to worry about this, that, or the other. No. Make no mistake about it. Rescheduling from Schedule 1, the most restrictive class of the Controlled Substance Act, to Schedule 3 means it's still a controlled substance. I don't know if you want me to give a spoiler alert, but there are significant differences between Schedule 1 and Schedule 3. By definition, a Schedule 1 substance is one without accepted medical value, high liability for abuse, no accepted safety profile. That is the definition of a Schedule 1 substance. You cannot have a prescription in this country for Schedule 1 substance. Schedule 3, on the other side, is not at all the same, right? It has accepted medical value. And when we think about the liability, it has moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. And their abuse potential is less than Schedules 1 and 2. It's higher than Schedules 4 and 5, but again, it's lower. So it's a very, very different thing. But rescheduling is not descheduling. That's the important thing. And the last thing I'll say about this in terms of what it means for folks like me, if you're interested in studying cannabis or cannabinoids, and you want to do things like clinical trials, you have to have a Schedule 1 substance if you're looking to study cannabis. That means at both the federal level and the state level, I have to hold a license, which I do, thankfully. The process can be arduous, and there are a lot of requirements and limitations and guidelines that have to be followed that are very different for Schedule 1 research versus Schedule 3 research. And we can get into the nuances. If anybody wants to talk about what I had to do to be approved to have very small amounts of cannabis and a 2,500 pound safe in our department, yeah. Or it has to be bolted. There's all sorts of requirements for storage and security, but there are some really important differences. For lack of a better explanation, I think many researchers acknowledge the limitations and hurdles that we have to deal with as Schedule 1 researchers. And it has limited enthusiasm for many people even thinking of getting into the game. So these things all have downstream effects.
Thank you so much for that, intro and, getting out there and answering some of those questions right away. I see more questions rolling in, so I think you've definitely sparked something in our audience. But before we get to some of those questions, I'd love to hear from you, Amber, and tell us about, what's happening currently, how it's affecting you, or just add some additional context to the timeline that I laid out or any of the remarks Dr. Gruber started with.
So a couple of things. First, I'll just kind of touch on the overview of what's happening. I think you have people falling, unfortunately, into two camps when it comes to there is, yay, rescheduling, this is awesome, this is all we need, let's do this. And then there are people who are saying, deschedule or bust. Unfortunately, as an industry, I think we often lack the capacity for nuance and to understand that two things can be true. We should absolutely deschedule cannabis. Hard stop. We need to end prohibition. Hard stop. That is just something that needs to happen. It's long overdue. But rescheduling is also a good thing. And so those two things can coexist. And unfortunately, I think what's being lost in both sort of the excitement about what could be with rescheduling and some of the really valid concerns and fears that exist about what will happen with rescheduling and the impacts that this will have overall on really meaningful priorities, like ensuring that we have continued patient access to cannabis medicine, that we are getting people out of jail. So all of these really valid concerns have overshadowed, I think, the truly historic and profound nature of what has just unfolded in front of us. We have an octogenarian, teetotaling, non-cannabis loving president who has come out and said, what we did was wrong. This makes no sense anymore. It makes no sense to continue to uphold this system anymore. I'm going to charge my administration with looking into this and taking action on this. And then we have a major department of government and an agency that have been resistant, would be a generous term, to making any progress and to moving forward, and the recognition of cannabis and marijuana as plant medicine, coming out and completely eviscerating the root of the stigma that has upheld prohibition. This idea that cannabis is dangerous, that it has no medical value, that your daughters are going to go crazy and take up with jazz musicians or whatever the fears have been. And so the idea that we have completely dismantled what has been the stated reason behind prohibition, as many of us know, there are a multitude of reasons, social and political reasons, that have also been why we've maintained our current federal position. But just the fact that this is a truly historic moment, and dismantling that stigma, nothing will happen without it. Because what we do when we take away the scientific basis for that stigma, we now take away any kind of a meaningful scientific justification for lawmakers to continue to uphold their position of fear and prejudice against this plant. And it starts to back folks in a corner. If an 80-year-old anti-cannabis drug warrior can come out and make these steps, and if HHS can come out and make these steps, then it puts pressure on Congress. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And so we're changing the conversation, and what has happened over the past year has been the biggest step towards ending prohibition that we have seen since it began. And I think it's really something worth taking a moment to reflect on and being excited about, but then also recognizing that with this comes a lot of a need to kind of act quickly, to make sure that we are guiding and participating in the process, not only to make sure that whatever regulatory shaping is done during this process, and that we are shaping the future of cannabis regulation in a way that allows us to have a place and to prioritize things like plant medicine and justice. And these are things that, again, I think will be lost if we are not all kind of coming together in this moment and being willing to dig into this complex and often really unsexy process. You know, I think as advocates, you and I have been in this for years together, and we know that the people that we've advocated with over the years have this beautiful vision, and they're in the gallery or they're standing next to the president and he's got his pen and they've done it and it's their narrative that won. And the idea that legalization doesn't look like that, and it again is this incremental, science-driven, complex process, is just a lot less sexy and attractive. To speak to the timeline, one of the biggest fears that I hear from people, and the biggest kind of unknowns for people, is, gosh, this could take forever. Like, this could take forever. Yeah, DEA says it and does it, but this like, are we looking at years? And so one of the things that people point to when going, oh my gosh, this could be a decade, is the rescheduling of hydrocodone combined products, kind of the Vicodins of the world. The process, I think, started, the cannabis folks point to 2004, but DEA points to 1999. So a 15-year process. But what's really important to note there is that 15-year process, with all of the things leading up to it, it was stops and starts. It was, you know, a lot of political push and pull. And then you have to think about what happened between the time that HHS didn't even want to take action. They didn't want to move these hydrocodone products from Schedule 3 to Schedule 2. Mind you, they were going the opposite direction. They were regulating it more strictly, which is a very different political ask and a very different kind of uphill battle. But that process, and during that process taking place, we have the opioid epidemic. And from that point, it moved a lot faster. And then when we got to the point that HHS finally said, hey, we're ready to do this, DEA take it away, to the day that it actually became a final rule, was 9 months. So we're not looking at 15 years. We're looking at 9 months from the place we're at now. If you go to Marinol, it's a very similar timeline. from HHS to final rule, and it's even shorter. It's closer to 6 months when you're looking at the hemp rescheduling. So again, I think it's a reason for optimism, and that we are not, hopefully not going to get bogged down in this, 19-year process, and recognizing that we don't have precedent for a timeline that is 15 years from the HHS recommendation to the final rule. That is stuff that occurred before.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that the comparison to a product that so many people are at least somewhat familiar with is helpful in this discussion, and helping people to understand what feels like a president making an announcement in late October of 2022 to then, almost 18 months later, someone saying, oh, the president hasn't delivered. You have to understand the process. You have to understand the external factors that influence what's going to happen or not going to happen. So again, thank you so much for that insight and getting us to this point in the conversation. I'm going to start with some of the questions that we received. And this one's a two-part question, Dr. Gruber. Will a Schedule III cannabis classification make it more accessible to research, especially regarding accessibility and funding for studies?
So it's a great question, and I just want to take one quick step back and focus on something that Amber said. So really, really important. Everybody should remember that currently, things like oxycodone and morphine, et cetera, are Schedule II substances, and the overdose, the number of overdose deaths that we have in this country are staggering and continue to be staggering. We're talking about cannabis, which is currently Schedule I. I just want to keep it in perspective, because sometimes people lose that, and I think it's important to point out. So in terms of rescheduling cannabis from 1 to 3, what happens in terms of research? First and foremost, the mindset of the nation is different. When we say that something has no currently accepted medical value, and then say, wait a minute, it has currently accepted medical value, the downstream effects of this are pretty stunning. And it helps to reduce stigma across the board. This is the kind of thing that is a multifactorial issue. Right? People have a negative stigma about cannabis and the use of cannabinoids, and people will tell you, look, it's a legal way for people to get high. I don't believe anybody's using for medical purposes, until we have an acknowledgement there is accepted medical value. Now, the FDA, again, to something Amber pointed out that I catch, and maybe some folks tuning in may or may not catch, but we currently have FDA approved medications that are synthetic forms of THC, synthetic forms of THC, not plant derived. I want to make the distinction because it's an important one. And again, remember back to my first point, cannabis is not one thing. There are hundreds of compounds, over 100 phytocannabinoids, things from the plant that interact with our own system of chemicals and receptors called endocannabinoids. Synthetic THC doesn't sit, by the way, in Schedule I either, but that's fine. We have 2 products that you can get that are synthetic THC. We now have an FDA-approved product that is a plant-derived purified form of CBD, or cannabidiol, Epidiolex, approved for pediatric onset intractable seizure disorders, right? So we have FDA-approved medications. It's much more challenging now to say no accepted medical value, right? We can say that. Of course, we have studies of whole plant products that are now allowing us to also go the one step further we needed to be able to move this. In terms of research, I think that the limits and restrictions on researchers with regard to having to carry state and federal Schedule I licenses, which are challenging to get and to keep, with regard to maintaining, again, storage and security requirements, like, sort of keeping up to date with all of those things. Being able to utilize products from more than one supply chain are often challenging for individuals. So it will likely open doors for more research to be done. That said, it's not as if we go from Schedule I to Schedule III and there's no issue or concern doing that. We do have problems with this. We currently have no mechanism for researchers like me to be able to study products that individuals use in their everyday lives. We don't have a mechanism for this. I don't know if any of the folks who are watching or are interested in hearing about this understand that currently you actually you can't do a clinical trial in this country on any products that are currently for sale in the marketplace. That's a huge problem. So when we're trying to understand as clinicians and researchers whether or not something has a benefit, if there's efficacy clinically or safety, what's the safety profile, we can't study what our patients are taking. or our consumers are interested in using. No harm, no foul, no judgment here, whether it's recreational / adult use or medical use, it's fine. We don't have the ability to study it legally. That's a problem. That's a problem.
Absolutely.
That's a bigger issue that we have to deal with. But yes, it should allow more research to be done. And in terms of funding, many of these decisions get made on the basis of a number of things. I don't see a clear, ooh, look, it went from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. However, in the case of academic institutions, there have been a number of concerns about engaging in activities that are, quote, illicit at the federal level, that may be state sanctioned. So remember, cannabis is not a legal substance at the federal level, although 38 states plus DC have some form of medical cannabis, and other states have, a number of states have adult and rec use. You could run the risk of losing some of your federal support. We've heard these complaints and these concerns. I'm sure Amber deals with these all the time. I heard a lot about this. We can't accept this money because we are in significant danger of losing this kind of funding. That would be different. So that's a real consideration.
Absolutely. The second part of that question was whether moving cannabis to Schedule 3, whether it would allow patients, greater access.
So I think this is one of the greatest misconceptions of rescheduling. And I don't know, maybe Amber has a different perspective. So for our recreational or adult consumers and our patients, again, we're going from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. It's not that it's not scheduled. It is still under government control. It'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of this changing. Again, states have their own laws. This is a federal shift. So it is not clear to me how access will increase in the very short term. I don't necessarily see a pathway for that. I think that there'll be more opportunities for other players in the arena, if you will, and greater opportunities for individuals to have different types of products made available to them. But to say that, well, again, what I tend to get is the misconception and the misperception of, rescheduling is descheduling, which means I can get it with no harm, no foul. It's very easy. It's like Advil. No, it's not like Advil. So I personally, for our patients, the patients that I see through our clinical trials and our clinical studies, for most of them here in this state, I don't see any change from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. That may not be the same across the country.
Something that you said about, no, it's not Advil, I think is a really important point, because I think one of the fears that people, again, have about rescheduling is, oh gosh, when it goes to Schedule 3, all of a sudden cannabis is a drug. And again, we know that there is an approval process. Cannabis is no more a legal drug on the day that that final rule is entered than it is, today. So I think that's a really important point to kind of internalize. And what you were talking about, you touched on this a little bit, and it's about risk and stigma. And that lessening, like through the accepted medical value and through it no longer being an illicit substance, the risk associated with being involved in any aspect of cannabis, whether that is your real estate, whether that is a banker, whether that is a lender, whether that is any type of a service provider. And so as we have more traditional and ancillary industries willing to support, or investors or research funders and philanthropists willing to support this, the marketplace, so the available resources, and then the cost, and anybody that is in the cannabis industry knows there is an incredible markup to do anything in the cannabis space because of this disconnect between state and federal law. And once that dissipates, and folks can no longer rely on this risk profile and this elevated risk profile, because that risk benefit analysis affects everything from a bank's willingness to take you in as even give you a bank account. It affects a realist, like a REIT's willingness to fund your business or give you property. Something that you mentioned was people that are otherwise federally regulated. So again, banks, in cities that have casinos, what we've seen a lot of, we deal with a range of what we call vice industries in the practice. And so there are concerns about maybe people that are federally regulated in something like gaming or agriculture, anywhere where there is housing, anywhere where there is a strong dependence on a relationship with the government and protecting a regulation. we have an opportunity. Now, it won't necessarily be automatic, but part of this process is going to be a legislative alignment and kind of shifting the law to actually align with the new status. And so these are things that could be really sensible wins, but they will not be automatic.
Got it. We've got a question here, kind of in line with this, and this question reads, what obstacles, policy-wise, at the national level can be changed outside of descheduling so that research on the actual products can be sold?
It's a great question. And you know, there have been a number of ballot initiatives that have actually included different caveats for researchers. For example, there would be, you know, forgiveness, if you will. And that's really what they call it, forgiveness, not allowance of forgiveness for people like me to be able to study the actual products our folks are using. So I think there are some things that can happen outside of complete descheduling. And those are generally being put forth, again, through a number of different legislative efforts, primarily bills. Many senators have tried to address this particular topic. People are very slowly, but clearly very surely coming to terms with the idea that policy has outpaced science. And so when we have legalization and people can access these things, terrific, mazel tov, except that we don't know if there's safety, we don't know if there's efficacy for certain things, and we should be able to answer those questions. As cannabis researchers, very often we are following the lead of our patients and our consumers and exploring what they're doing to try to figure out the best and most safest and most efficacious ways for them to use. So I think ballot initiatives are likely the way that people do this. I'm not a legislator. I don't even play one on TV. But I think that that's probably the way to do it. Should there be an opportunity for people who are cannabis researchers to understand exactly the landscape of products available in the marketplace for both medical and recreational/adult use, who should or shouldn't, what are the most likely indications or symptoms or conditions that are improved versus potentially worsened, all of these things. Should we have some idea of that? Of course we should. Do we currently have the ability to do that? No, we don't. And that goes way beyond this. So kudos to whoever asked the question. Some of us are quietly but very insistently, you know, hoping that this changes soon. And when we get to the hemp space, I will tell you the one great thing about the 2018 Farm Bill that took hemp and hemp-derived products out of the issue of the CSA. And for those who don't know, in this country, hemp is a variety of cannabis defined as containing equal to or less than 0.3% THC by weight. There's some distinction about whether that's the final product or the source chemovar strain. Amber knows very well because we can monkey with this. It's a very gray area for some of the less responsible vendors, perhaps, maybe. But you know, these kinds of things are important to keep in mind. We actually have the ability in some cases to do sort of what I would call a quasi-experimental trial for things that are in the marketplace. We can actually observe people using in their own environments, but it shouldn't be a jungle habitat approach. We shouldn't be watching wildlife in their own environs, and that's how we make our statements. We should be able to actually do clinical research on real world products in real world folks using them for real world problems.
It's such a critical piece of getting us to that final phase of legalization. It is the ultimate standard of scientific validation that we need, and not being able to do that is really a hindrance. When I think of kind of the federal level, this is where this opportunity around rescheduling will come naturally with regulatory fixes and alignments throughout the government. It will come with legislative fixes. It will come with policy fixes. And this subject itself is perfect. It is the perfect fit. It's not big. It's not hyper political. It aligns with the ultimate goal of making it safer. And so these are the type of things that we should be thinking about and finding ways to incorporate into these packages that are going to be going out both to agencies and legislatively, as we're going to be, hopefully aligning the laws to conform to the new status quo and the new schedule.
I want to take this in a little bit of a different direction. And I want to, Amber, hear from you, when we address this question. What challenges might arise in the transition from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 in terms of standardization, quality control, and patient access? And then I'm going to come to you, Dr. Gruber. I know we've touched on patient access, so let's talk a bit about standardization and quality control.
So while I don't think the action itself has a big, giant, meaningful day one impact, I am really hopeful that a few things that are unfolding currently are going to impact the industry's recognition that this needs to change. So I think if we go back to the HHS recommendation itself, one of the elements of it that I think was really exciting to me, having come from a highly regulated consumer products background and industries that have had some challenges when it came to having sort of quality standards. And one of the underlying themes of the recommendation was, hey, listen, we don't actually have a concern with use of cannabis. It's not the use of cannabis. What it is, it's the misuse that is the problem. And then throughout the data presented, they went on to highlight areas of concern that are things that we should be focusing on collectively as an industry. And people want to riot when I mention THC potency levels. This is something that we're going to have honest conversations about, whether it's limits, whether it's marketing, whether it's packaging, whether it's dosing. There has to be a conversation around it, because what they're seeing on the state level, what the federal government is seeing, are concerns around high potency products, people with pre-existing conditions potentially that react adversely when products get into the hands of children. And so we have this opportunity really laid out in front of us, with HHS saying, hey, listen, we get it. And we acknowledge that responsible use is not the problem. Where the problem exists is when there is misuse of this product. And so we have an incredible opportunity through this to get ahead, because the alternative, and I have seen the alternative, and I assure you, you want to self-regulate. You want to be proactive in outlining what a responsible industry looks like. Because if the government, state or federal, regulates you in a moment of crisis, you are not going to like it. It is going to be overly burdensome. It will not usually be sensible. And overall, it will negatively impact your business and the public in general. So I think there's that aspect, and I think it's an opportunity. I think on the other side, there is this moment in time where we are unable to distinguish the legal cannabis industry from the wild west of hemp-derived cannabinoid, hemp-derived, I'm going to put air quotes on that. So theoretically hemp-derived cannabinoids and the really lax regulatory space that we have there, and some of the really concerning products that are coming out of there. If the cannabis industry doesn't seize this opportunity in this moment to distinguish themselves, they will go down with that ship as well, because we have a loosely regulated space with a questionable supply chain and some extraordinary questionable marketing practices. And so I see this more as an opportunity. And as we start to have these regulatory discussions about what the framework looks like, something that as we grow as an industry and understand in our maturity is that you want to come with an idea about what responsible regulation looks like. This isn't just about, you know what, you're going to let me exist and you're just going to let me just do my business and with no concern about the future. The reality is, if you can operate responsibly, it's a competitive advantage. And so when you can be when you could economically make responsible and safe products, you have an advantage. And you also really contribute to the sustainability over time of an industry and of your business. I will tell you that coming from dietary supplements, we've seen some really big, major changes in that space. The first was when ephedrine was taken away, and anybody who is little more mature in your on in years, will remember the glory days of these crazy fat burners that were highly effective, but eventually that product went away, and we saw companies that were decimated by this. On the flip side of this, we saw when there were a lot of steroid analogs that were ending up in dietary supplements, and we saw the impact that these companies that kept insisting that they could put these steroids into dietary supplements, the overall corrosive impact that that had on the industry. And it is an impact that still remains today. And so I think we really can borrow from the need to take action and sort of use this opportunity and use these conversations to lay out what responsible actors look like and what the standards look like and what we want regulation to look like, because we don't want to end up in a position that other industries have ended up in, where there were initially blinders to the potential public health consequences, and then boom, you have a crisis, legal public health crisis that is undoing the industry as a whole. And if we are not mindful, that is a path that we could head down.
No, you hit the nail on the head in so many ways. Dr. Gruber, did you want to add to that?
No, I think these are all incredibly good points. And I think when we think about things like risk to public health policy, people are sometimes, it's all or nothing, right? So we hear this all the time. Listen, it's natural. Everyone should be allowed to use it no matter what. Well, arsenic is natural. I don't know that we really feel this way. That's probably not a great mantra to go ahead and perpetuate. We certainly know that there are risks to certain cohorts, just like Amber referred to, individuals with pre-existing conditions, individuals who may be taking certain substances are at risk for drug-drug interactions. Our very young consumers whose brains are neurodevelopmentally vulnerable. We never say it's not just say no, it's just not yet. Our older consumers who have reduced metabolism and all sorts of other things to be concerned about. We have some concerns about individuals using it. It's not that it's no risk. It's a question of how to allow people to use and not have a maladaptive pattern of use, right? That's really a big concern here. And I think that when we think about cannabis, people are often surprised because we talk about it being a Schedule I substance, but the other substances, when we think about risks to public health, when we think about cannabis or marijuana compared to other substances, is really quite striking and very, very different. And the HHS report was really quite revealing in that way, in terms of looking at cannabis being in the lowest possible rankings. When we think about greatest adverse consequences, it's almost always heroin and benzodiazepines, cocaine, things like this, right? Up in the top, not really cannabis. Doesn't mean there's no risk. It means that we have to be mindful about use and use patterns. And certainly that's not a surprise. But I think in terms of being mindful about regulatory structures, it's a very, very important point. And I think that people very often have no idea what they're getting in certain less regulated spaces currently. And there are certainly things to be concerned about in that space as well. There are no mandated label requirements for certain products that are freely available in the marketplace. And no one wants to step on anyone's toes, but it would be nice if our folks were able to discern relatively easily what's in their product. Because for some people, certain constituents are contraindicated. It's just that simple. So I think this is a tremendous, tremendous opportunity.
Fantastic. I want to stay on this topic a little bit. We have a question that asks, are there any specific medical conditions or treatments that could benefit most from a reclassification of cannabis to Schedule III?
So, again, I don't know that there's any preferential condition, indication, or symptom that will benefit from going from 1 to 3. The top 3 conditions that people seek medical cannabis or cannabis for in this country, and they jockey for 1, 2, and 3, depending on where you are in the country: chronic pain, mood and anxiety related symptoms, and sleep disruption. Those are the top 3. And in mood, we talk about anxiety, depression, PTSD always factors in there. It really depends on where you are. So I think by the numbers, if we do a numbers game, I think the largest cohort are probably those with chronic pain. And there is the most compelling evidence in this realm, probably, right, for cannabis and cannabinoids being effective for at least some types of pain in some patients at some points. Like, there's all these caveats that we have to throw out there, right? But we're getting there incrementally, like, a couple steps, little baby steps, but we're moving forward. I don't know that there's any, advantage for any condition. I would think by the numbers, if we move from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, and there is an incentivization, if you will, for individuals or entities to get in the game with regard to research and development, novel products. We spend a lot of our time here. Then very likely those people with the more common, those indications, again, by the numbers, are more likely to have options that will be effective. That would be my guess. It's pure conjecture. It's not like if we move from 1 to 3, this one tiny, indication benefits above all else. I don't think so. I don't think that there's anything like that. But I think when we look at the numbers of people who are using cannabis for things like chronic pain, and again, very often what we see are people who are using for not one indication or condition, but multiple ones. And let's be honest, when people have chronic pain, they often have mood disruption, whether it's depression or anxiety. Pain can be very depressing, and major depression or depressive symptoms are painful. There are lots of inextricably linked things here, so we have to be holistic about it. So I don't know that any one condition or indication sort of takes precedence. That's my long-winded answer to your short question.
Well, we thank you for that answer. This one is kind of along the same lines, but I want to answer it specifically. Would a change in scheduling impact the ability of physicians and healthcare providers to discuss and recommend cannabis to their patients?
So that's a really good question. So I think I said this in my intro, and a lot of people don't realize this. You cannot have a prescription in this country for a Schedule 1 substance. Full stop, hard stop, like you can't. So that is a very, very significant consideration. And people don't understand how limiting that is for any and all individuals. The only federally legal way for you to currently have, quote, advice about using cannabis essentially is through an IND, or investigational new drug research study. That's crazy because states have their own rules and regulations about allowing the use of cannabis for medical purposes. So I think the short answer here is it will certainly facilitate conversations. It will certainly allow individuals to have prescriptions written. The question is, what are we writing the prescriptions for? What is available currently that falls under this particular category that individuals would be availing themselves of? Because I don't know the answer to that yet. Like I said earlier, we currently have one plant-derived product FDA approved for medical conditions, right? Epidiolex. So I'm not sure how that's going to shake out. Do I think it will facilitate conversations? Absolutely. Do I think that people will be much more inclined to be considerate and open and receptive to these, quote, alternative approaches, which is how I usually get the calls, my patient wants to try this crazy newfangled alternative thing. Not crazy or new, but okay. Pretty old, thousands and thousands of years, but that's fine. So I think it will actually facilitate dialogue and conversation between physicians and their patients. And again, I think it will allow people to have a different perspective. I'm not sure what that translates to. Maybe Amber has thoughts about it, because we don't have this pipeline of things like, oh, look, we have these things, because, they're just not there.
I mean, again, I'm a little bit of a broken record with this, and this is an opportunity. So while it is not an automatic fix that all of a sudden your doctor can prescribe you weed, this is an opportunity to look at things like people being able to even have conversations. I know that there's been concerns that VA doctors can't even have really open and candid conversations with their patients about cannabis and cannabis use. So even if we get to the point where doctors feel comfortable to have conversations with people, or if we can get some protections for doctors that are giving recommendations at the state level, these are things that are stopping short of us needing to do something that's a far bigger lift with blessing, state level cannabis programs with the, kind of the equivalent status of a prescribed drug, which has all kinds of regulatory, public health, social, political challenges in front of it. But we can take smaller steps, again, protecting state level doctors, allowing conversations to even happen, because part of changing, again, incremental, again, not big sexy bill signing, but incremental, getting it so that doctors and older doctors that may be nervous about this can have conversations with their patients. And then all of a sudden their highly successful, respected, patient is talking about their cannabis use and how it's helped them. And so these are things that, again, we should be thinking about as this process unfolds, that they may not be the big ultimate win that we want, but we can get considerably closer. And these are steps that we're going to have to take along the way, because there is no path, given how steeped in fear and misinformation and just even legal and regulatory challenges this plan is. There is no pathway to just boom, we're legal. And so these are really critical steps in being able to get us there, and being able to get doctors like Dr. Gruber the information and the opportunities to gather the data that they need.
It's a great point, though, about the VA, and I can't say this enough about our veterans. We have a program serving those who have served, right? Because they're desperate, and highly understudied, and often unhurt, and they cannot have conversations. In fact, their benefits are threatened on a rather constant basis if they disclose or are found to be positive for a metabolite, right? All of a sudden, they can't get prescriptions filled for this, that, or the other, because they're also using cannabis. That would change, right? In terms of the ability for physicians to discuss and have an actual prescription for something that's a cannabinoid-based medication, right? That's a major step. And I think, again, I completely concur. Any incremental change in a positive direction is good.
That's right. I want to thank you both for bringing up vets. When we talk about cannabis policy reform, when we talk about rescheduling, we have to be specific and nuanced in understanding the additional limitations that particular population has, even with some of the movement that we've made at the state level, and now talking about what's happening at the federal level. So I think I know we could spend an hour asking some of our other members of the Center of Excellence, vets specifically, about this. And I hope we get a chance to do that in the future, because there are just so many, again, details specific to our veteran population that we have to make sure that we are conscious of and intentional about making sure that our policy reform works for them as well. So again, just thank you again for mentioning that in your responses. Amber, what are the potential economic implications of rescheduling cannabis? Could this change pave the way for federal taxation and regulations similar to any other industries?
So, I mean, one of the biggest things, and I think it's the excitement that exists within industry about this potential fix, really can't be understated, and that would be getting rid of 280. It is one of the few things that will go away without a big, to do an extended process. And so for those who may not know, 280E is a provision of the law that was intended to make it economically unfeasible for criminal enterprises to function. So just basically tax them out of existence by not allowing them to take regular business deductions. This is particularly challenging for small businesses, particularly retail businesses. So the effect that this has on social equity programs, or that this has on small businesses, is profound. It is bad for anyone, but as we see, we're starting to see some of the large operators find ways, with the help of hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in attorneys' fees, to find ways to minimize this overhead. But the removal of 280E, we are seeing effective tax rates as high as 70, 75 to 95%. It's hard to run a small business on your best day without 280E. It is virtually impossible to run it otherwise. I spoke to a regulator who said that 75% of the licenses that are relinquished around tax on the state level. And that is devastating to me. That means that this is just crippling businesses. So when that money is no longer going to the IRS, there is an opportunity to reinvest it into the workforce, into infrastructure, into research, and the profitability and the valuations of these companies, and the ability for these companies to be able to sustain and operate responsibly and hire security and do all of these things that normal responsible industries can do, because they're not just surviving that really changes. And then we also see, in addition to the kind of the risk profile going down, as more money comes in, when any firm, whether it's a bank or an investor, an insurance company is doing their risk benefit analysis, the more money you have, the more inclined they are to address the risk and to face that risk with you. And so the impact that this has really can't be understated. And having served exclusively and represented exclusively small minority businesses in this space for years, it is painful to watch a real misconception that operators of color in this space need to be anti-rescheduling and sort of anti-280E reforms. When I talk to them personally and they're like, it's killing me. Like, I can't survive like this. And so a lot of, I think, the resistance against that comes from people who are not actually underneath the consequences of 280E, and definitely not the ones that are feeling it the worst. And so I am excited for all of the people that can't afford fancy law firms like Ice Miller to be able to help them reduce their tax overhead, and just normal human beings trying to survive in this space and what that means. And so I am most excited about what it does for small businesses, and the impact that it has for them, the access to capital, just the existence of capital and it not going. I will throw in one point of caution, and that is, we have existed as an industry in a space where we haven't gotten a lot of lawsuits, which is shocking because we are a high risk consumer product with all kinds of touch points and sensitivities. And I do believe that we have been potentially lulled into a false sense of security that, hey, we're doing great. And we have no exposure because we haven't been largely sued and consistently sued and attacked in big ways like I've seen other industries. We are effectively judgment proof. And so attorneys are going to go after companies they can recover from. And they're not going to go after us right now. So when that money from 280E is now going back into your pocket and being reinvested, and you have an additional veneer of kind of jurisdiction that they feel that, hey, I can really go after you because you're actually a legitimate business now, please do not think for 5 minutes that money will not go right back into the hands of plaintiffs' attorneys instead of the IRS if you are not being very mindful about things that I think people have been able to be a little bit more lax about from a marketing, product quality standards perspective, things that plaintiffs' bars just sit and just rub their hands together going like skimming regulations and looking for soft spots. And I've been in industries that are constantly fighting that battle, and consumer products industries that are constantly fighting that battle. And that's going to be us. And soon, once we're grown up, we're about to be a grown-up industry and are taking big steps to being a big grown-up industry. And I just want people to be prepared for that. And again, I keep coming back to this, but this is a huge step that we're taking towards legitimacy and towards legality. And I just really want to implore people to make sure that an exponentially increased emphasis on what we're doing as an industry and how we're operating, because the conversations are going to shift.
Thank you, Amber. I mean, we've scratched the surface. I think we hit some of the main points and answered a lot of folks' questions. And so with 5 minutes left, I just want to start with you, Dr. Gruber, and ask for, your final thoughts for this particular session. I don't think it's the last time we'll be talking about this. So please just take a couple of minutes to impart some wisdom on our viewers today and those that will be able to watch this recording in the future.
Sure. So I think for today, when we think about what does rescheduling from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 mean, the quick and dirty answer is it depends on who you are, right? And it's important to keep in mind because it's different from what you might think. For researchers, the burden of meeting regulatory requirements and mandates is likely to be reduced. That may facilitate more people jumping into the game or staying in the game. Lots of people are getting out of the business because it's really hard. For businesses, as you just heard from Amber, 280E goes away. So now there's this giant tax benefit and incentive for people lower effective tax rate. Most importantly, from my perspective, for consumers and our medical cannabis patients, we are rescheduling, not descheduling, very important, right? So in terms of cannabis itself is still a controlled substance. That's an important distinction, but it allows for an increased dialogue and recognition and validation, if you will, that cannabis, the acknowledgement of shifting from 1 to 3 means cannabis has accepted medical value, right? That's the one big thing about Schedule 1, no accepted medical value, high liability for abuse, right, or dependence, and no accepted safety profile. So Schedule 3 brings that, way down. That's important. And again, when we think about the acceptance of medical use at being a major step forward, the downstream effects of that shifting mindset across the nation for policymakers, for healthcare providers, and for our patients and consumers, that's a very, very important set of first steps to take.
Thank you, Dr. Gruber.
Sure.
Amber,
Yeah,
you've been dropping
I think
gems all hour, but please.
I've talked a lot about preparation and about being engaged. I really want to call on people on both sides. Like I said, we have these two camps, unfortunately, of people. And I really want to call on the industry side in particular. We have gotten this far because, in part, we have been able to ride the movement of medical patients. We've been able to ride the movement for criminal justice. We have been able to ride the credibility and the honor and the contributions of veterans to drive this movement forward. Those are 3 areas that need to be pulled forward as we embark on this regulatory process. And so part of the process of creating a reasonable framework and creating a sustainable framework is going to be incorporating those elements into that. And we're talking about organizations that are often resource light. So it is incumbent upon industry and those with the resources to be doing the outreach and to be including these really critical elements of what a sustainable and healthy and responsible industry looks like. Because if we ignore these elements, these medical patients will turn to other markets. Medical patients may be misusing their medication. If we are ostracizing communities of color, we've again seen examples of this in other industries where we really need to enfranchise vulnerable communities to make sure that not only are they economically benefiting, but we are protecting them from a public health perspective. And then lastly, of course, our veterans are such a critical part of our culture and society, and they have such incredible hurdles to being able to access medicine that we've shown they can benefit from most. So I really just implore people to get on this process. Regulations are not fun. They're not super fun. I mean, to me, probably to a fault of anybody who's been out with me socially on a weekend, but they're hard. And I encourage you to just get involved in the process, because if not, this will be laid out for us. And I don't think that we're going to like what it looks like. So.
Well, thank you both. Thank you so much for the work that you continue to do with CPEAR Center of Excellence. Thank you for taking the time today to help us kick off our Ask Me Anything series. Thank you for joining in and watching. If you want to learn more about the research and work that we're doing here, please visit cpear.org. Have a wonderful day. Please reach out to us with questions that we didn't get answered, and we'll be sure to answer them on Twitter or X. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.